2018, I was asked by the mysterious synthwave duo Luscious-235 to add saxophone to their album End.Game. In this episode, I talk with them, Anu Kirk and Brian Ward, about the ideas, inspirations, and secrets hidden in the album, which was released on New Year's Day 2019. The second. Let me try to troubleshoot this for just a second. Oh, go ahead, sorry.
I was asking Anu what kind of bass he has behind him.
That is a Kubicki key factor. Some people don't like the way it looks.
19A0s. Do you say 1980s?
I say 19AOs, kind of like the 1980s, but 19AO. And it has always struck me as being kind of like counting in hexadecimal, where it's like you get past 9 and then you go A, B, C, D, E, F.
Rob pronounces it the same way, like just the 1980s, and he says that's the way they pronounce it in Britain, actually.
1980s.
Yep.
I think it'll be great for listeners to hear what's that all about.
It's about a lost time.
Yeah, if listeners want to understand the concept, there's a couple of references. And so the main one is, as Brian noted, this Rob Beskiza article called Mixtape of the Lost Decade. And if you search for Mixtape of the Lost Decade, it was on Boing Boing. It's this weird little article that I read in 2011, and it resonated with me right away. And I thought, this is a really interesting piece or interesting idea. And basically the idea is that there is actually a period of time, like between some number of years between 1979 and 1985, were actually erased or deleted or somehow redacted from humanity's memory.
Right after I read that, I went and wrote the rough draft of the story on the insert of the record. And basically it said, I'm an artificial human, and that we had this band, Sid Luscious and I. But we were playing this ridiculous show underground, and so when all these nukes went off, the EMP protected me, and so I didn't shut down.
And the argument that this short story that this piece is making is that basically if you look at this sort of tremendous rapid growth or change in art and technology during that period of time, it can only be explained by the fact that you don't remember. In 1979, humanity experienced dramatic, rapid technological advancement, which has since been quietly removed from the historical record. One day, everything was blurry analog. The next, primitive but speedily evolving digital. Where did it come from? How did everything change so fast? Was it extraterrestrials? Or ancient secrets from the Toltecs, Mayans, or Egyptians? Maybe it was a series of covert government projects.
I don't know if I'm descending into conspiracy theory with the whole climate of today, but I'm sort of thinking the 19AOs was real. and how were you guys communicating? You know, if this is the first time we're getting you guys together, I mean, this is just very far out to me. I mean, I'm just kind of in awe. I just want to hear a little bit of the story.
We're going to some history about Chill Productions then.
Absolutely. Tell them about Chill.
Well, as far as we can tell, it's the first net label ever made. It was founded in 1994 by John Tate in Toronto, and I kind of sort of took over in 2013, kind of avant-garde experimental music.
But basically towards the middle or end of the 90s, there was this kind of moment in time where the internet had its own music scene that was based around what were called trackers. A tracker is a piece of music software that's kind of like making music with a spreadsheet. That was how we initially met. And what had happened is I had finished working on new Sid Luscious in the Pants album, Pandemonium, in the end of 2017, and basically said, well, you know, do you want to try to collaborate on something? And he was like, yeah, that'd be great. And like it seemed like maybe 2 or 3 days later he had sent me a track to work on.
Wow.
And I sat down and opened it up and had some inspiration and put some vocals on it and sent it back to him. And about a week went by and I didn't hear anything, and I was just like, well, I guess he did it. And that's the end of that. And then he got back to me all of a sudden and was like, oh my God, this is amazing. I'm super pumped. And this right now is literally the first time we've talked in person simultaneously ever.
Over 20 years.
Yeah.
Yep, indeed.
Well, somehow I feel like something really good or really bad is going to happen by the fact that I got you guys together in the same time frame. This might be a glitch. Can you just introduce what you guys were doing in terms of the sound, and the way I call it is like retro future.
Like I asked Anu to keep the vocal production pretty low, not a whole lot of post-processing. I think that's one thing that has to do with it. It's there, but, I like not being able, I don't like the vocal processing to be in your face so much.
That puts a protagonist in the story. There's someone talking to you. Oh, yeah.
You mentioned retro future, and yes, absolutely. I'd say that one thing I like to do is I do a lot of work kind of around my records and write a lot of notes and do a lot of research and think about things. And we were both really interested in synthwave. In particular, we had both been kind of inspired by a record that Laserhawk did called Dream Rider. Mm-hmm. But having listened to a bunch of synthwave, I think we both felt that while there were some cool ideas and vibes in there, it was a really straight-jacketed genre. When I started thinking about the 19 AOs and all of these things, I was like, well, it's this notion of like time being out of order or out of joint. What if you could discover a record from the past that was ahead of its time? With knowing that we wanted to do something synthwavy, there were immediately some palette choices of like, okay, we know there's going to be like Lindrum samples and analog synths and things like that.
Wanted it to sound like a record of singles from another time.
Oh, yeah. I only heard these songs in isolation from each other as singles. When I first heard it all together, that's when I realized this is a freaking story. But then they all work as little fragments.
I was thinking about other books I'd read and things like that, where it's almost like the chapters are shuffled. Mm-hmm. Even for thinking about the sounds, one of the things that I thought of early on was I knew that I wanted to have a list of the gear that we used in the liner notes. When I was making up that list, I put in some gear that didn't exist. I made up some synthesizers that sound like they should have been real.
TS-79 or an ARP 2550.
Wow, that is definitely what do you call it in video games when you find that that secret key thing?
Like an Easter egg?
Easter egg. That's some Easter egg shit right there. Yeah. The level of detail that you guys put in is pretty amazing.
Well, I'm personally glad that he insisted that we go with John Carver for the artwork. Because everyone else in synthwave is doing the same thing. It all looks the same. It just, wash and magenta and cyan. Whereas this, John's got a very unique style with his art. I mean, no.
It's amazing. Yeah. It's great that you guys link the visual and the audio together. There's also a visual language here.
We were definitely thinking about visuals from the start, and Brian and I, in addition to sending music back and forth to each other, both our own and source inspiration, we were also sending images. And I had seen some really striking imagery associated with a project called Evidence of Time Travel by John Fox from Ultravox and Steve D'Agostino. And looking at the credits and stuff, I found out that this guy John Carborn had done both video and still imagery, and I suggested to Brian that maybe we should see if he would do art for our project. So we commissioned, he agreed, we sent him some rough tracks and told him a little bit about the project, and he was like, yeah, sure. It sort of immediately helped pull things into focus with this kind of glitchy, gritty, retro future aesthetic and the kind of starkness of the black and white color scheme.
That's great that music and art and audio and visual are coming together, that they're not standalone in this project.
When you buy a record, you always are going to be drawn to that one with the very cool artwork on the front,
If we're going to do a little advertising plug, that artwork will be available as a bonus, right? If you buy the thing on Bandcamp, there's going to be a bonus.
So I think what we're going to do is put out a book, like a digital PDF. We had been planning to do a hardback. But the other thing, to your point, John, the records I've loved the most have been ones that have been suggestive of an entire world.
Like
That's always been
by Pink Floyd.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All in your face. It's just beautiful.
And it's hard to think about some of those records without thinking about the art. And it's part of why we decided to do the limited vinyl run as well. Because we felt like we actually ended up with something that kind of merited, a tangible, nice art piece.
That's funny. Records are now standalone pieces of art. You don't have to play them anymore.
I mean, even our local Walmart now, they're selling records. I bought Slim Shady LP on vinyl there just the other day.
when Walmart starts doing it, you know the conspiracy is working. Something's happening. By the way, here's John Carborn right behind me.
That's right.
You said.
That's right.
We do have the future on tape. I have these songs sort of queued up a little bit. And the first song, it's interesting. I'm just going to put it on for a little vibe in the background, you know? At first I was like, maybe I just got the rough draft. There's some skipping here, glitching out. Can you talk about this a little bit?
Well, we were close to the end of the record when we made this, weren't we? And it just so happened I had written like a little intro, and those drums are different drums. So you notice those are heaviosity drums. It needed a different sound for that, really bring it in heavy. Do some glitch on it, and then we had our intro song.
Yeah, I had this idea pretty early on that I wanted to frame the record with a little intro piece, right? Again, thinking about the other records that I love that had these little interstitial bits or this little kind of intro. And I was again thinking about like growing up in the 80s and seeing these weird shows on TV like In Search Of, and I had this notion about kind of like recreating the PBS intro stinger. One secret I will give away is that there's a musical motif in there that is actually coded year names describing the 19 AOs. So just like we're talking about how there's time missing, well, one of the years that it starts is 1979. So if you listen, one of the motifs goes from the 1 to the 9 to the 7 to the 9, and then it goes from the 1 to the 9 to the 8 to the 5, and then there's one that goes from the 1 to the 9 to an A, and then stops. I was thinking about like old TV shows and was trying to get across the idea that this is unreliable, been damaged somehow, or that pieces are missing. And I was thinking about analog TV. So that's why there's the kind of like channel switching static noise and some of the glitch. I was thinking about how those TVs used to kind of like roll.
You've noted that the whole record has a cinematic feel. And the intro and outro, I think, really help, bookend that. Starts off with the PBS stinger. Can you explain a little bit, what is PBS stinger?
I missed that reference.
If you remember back, like public television, sometimes between their shows, they would have this little thing where the P and the B and the S would appear animated, and they would have that little bit of music. I think this video actually has this sound on it. Let me see here real quick. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah.
And then listen to that first track that we did. You'll clearly hear like, oh, yeah, we're trying to do something that's just like that. It's got the same kind of warbly synthesizer fall.
So in terms of the cinematic, actually, there is an order to these songs. New Year's Day is the beginning of something dark.
We didn't really order the songs until near the very end, but we kind of knew, just like with the record we're working on now, we got a list of, we're going to make these songs with these names. I kind of go off of what he writes, and then I make a groove based off of that, and I send it to him. And then he sends me back what I think is magic.
Very kind, Brian. As an example of how we would work, Brian sent me some loops. Like working title or the file name for it was just New Year's Day, and I believe it was because
I written it on New Year's Day of 2018.
Yeah. And of course, I immediately saw that, and I was like, "Oh, well, that gives me an idea for what I can write about for lyrics."
Party like it was 1979 or 85, because it was, and it felt like everything was alright. But I knew, we knew this couldn't last. Too much too fast.
Brian had sketched out this story about us sort of surviving some kind of apocalypse. And I thought about a song that's kind of describing starting over, looking towards the future. This is one that I don't necessarily want to get too specific about because I think it's important for people to keep their own ideas about its meaning. But in general, I think we've all been in places where you kind of find your life maybe broken up a little bit. While that can be very sad, there's also something beautiful about having the slate wiped clean.
And so since you're not going to spill any beans about this, I'll have my own interpretation. I thought that the pairing of the first song and New Year's Day was brilliant because it's almost like a T.S. Eliot moment. The end of the world is not, the huge bomb and explosion. I mean, you could have started off with like noise and chaos, but the disruption is almost just like a glitch. We didn't even notice it.
It actually is a good example of one of the songs where I wasn't sure if what we were doing was any good or not.
The first time I heard your vocals on it, it just floored me. I was just in awe. Like, and I helped do that? Are you kidding me? Wow.
It's a good thing about collaboration. You can criticize each other, but then you can be each other's cheerleader too. From personal experience, when you're working by yourself, you're always in self-doubt,
I had not actually collaborated with anybody in a really long time. In fact, I think, John, our first collaboration on Pandemonium was one of the first times I had done that in a long time, and it was because that was so successful that I felt comfortable reaching out to Brian. And Brian, you were amazing through this process, just in terms of like keeping me excited about it and being so fired up about what we were doing. It was really perhaps the best thing about the project for me.
Ocean City for me, it has the most retro influences.
Yes.
I was thinking Ocean City, Maryland.
That's correct.
Oh yeah?
Yes.
And there's weird symbols that start recurring. This is where they're getting introduced, actually. The pyramids, half dreams, all this kind of like sinister stuff is starting to crack through on Ocean City. What the hell is going on here?
Well, as you know, John, Ocean City is a real place, and it's in Maryland. And for listeners who don't know, John and I went to high school together. And our senior high school class spent Beach Week at Ocean City. And for me, it represented a kind of teenage paradise. I was thinking about these sort of moments that were just gone. And I thought of Ocean City. And I was also combining those feelings and ideas with something I remembered from an Alex Proyas film called Dark City, where a place called Shell Beach featured prominently in the story. And just trying to create this sense of longing for this almost mythical place or this moment that was just out of reach.
It was sort of always in our imagination. Let's go enjoy Ocean City. It was there. It has a especially dark place in my heart is because
Ocean City is waiting for us. Ocean City and all we have lost. We could be there today. We'll find a way back to Ocean City.
First of all, I'm very sorry that happened to you, John. It's terrible. One of the things I wanted to stress is that, I realized that Ocean City, like this idea, didn't match up with the actual place. Of course, you go back there and it's like, it's just a crummy, rundown beach town that smells bad and is kind of economically depressed. One of the things that struck me was that kind of gap between what it represented and the actual reality of it, both then and now. Part of what I loved about the name Ocean City is that it is a real place, but it sounds like a completely made-up place. It is almost...
it's a concept.
Yeah, it's a concept.
So when you first hear Ocean City and you might be driving in your car, for instance, it has a kind of feel-good thing, but there's a little bit of chords, there's a little bit of guitar angst, there's a little bit of things cracking on the edge, which you get the next time you listen to it. So I think that's the brilliant thing about this record is that there's a first impression and then there's a second and third and fourth impression. Midnight Drivin', guys. Brian Ward, you're in your car. At least on your avatar, you're in your car.
Yeah, it's a Lincoln. I don't have a very cool car. I have a practice. That song is pretty much straight nostalgia. I think it's one of the first ones we wrote.
It's a convertible top-down kind of car.
No,
I mean,
it's
kind of song, no?
well, the song, yeah, but mine's an SUV. Sorry.
Yeah, Midnight Drivin' was the first song we did for the record. Part of what I was thinking about is that, driving at night is a real trope for synthwave. One of the big breakthrough synthwave tracks was a song by Kavinsky called Night Call.
I have the single on vinyl.
Yeah, which is clearly a bit of a reference for this. And, of course, the entire movie Drive, which you may have seen.
I haven't seen that yet. I got to.
You need to watch that movie. That's pretty great.
It's pretty good. And Miami Vice.
Miami Vice, it really holds up, I think. And you can clearly see it was a different time. The cops portrayed the act so much different. And it's kind of dark. A lot of the themes on Miami Vice are really dark that they don't even play anymore.
We could drive all night. Do you wanna go out midnight driving? Do you wanna go to the midnight driving? Rocky Horror Show and then El Topo. Let's go midnight driving.
I was thinking about these different tropes and our youth in the 80s and the excitement of having a license and being able to drive around, particularly going to movie theaters to Midnight Madness, and where you might see strange and provocative films, perhaps in an altered state of some sort. And this was back in a time where media wasn't on demand at all, right? Like if I think part of the fascination with driving and the nostalgia attached to it is back in this pre-internet time where you had to go somewhere to get anything.
Where in the compositional place did Better Off Dead come in then? It's in contrast to Drive. It has a lot more different kind of sonic space.
Of the songs on the record, the majority of them were written by Brian basically coming up with the bones of the track. Right? But there were a couple songs that I took the lead on. When we were starting to kick around working on the record, one of the documents that we were passing back and forth was just kind of a list of potential song titles. One of the things I had thrown in there was Better Off Dead, which is the title of a Savage Steve Holland comedy starring John Cusack.
Oh. Okay.
Which is it's a masterpiece of 80s cinema. It's
It's not the one where the kid's chasing him around for his $2.
Yes, exactly. I want my $2. I was sort of asking questions of myself, like if there was this terrible thing that happened in the world and most people are gone or can't remember it, how traumatic would it be to be one of the only people who survived or did remember? If you were singing to like your friend or your lover who was gone, there's this kind of like, well, you're actually you're better off dead. You're not stuck here in the ruins with the rest of us. And then compositionally, I had this idea pretty early on that there were some things I wanted to rip off.
Oh yeah.
There's a couple of Tangerine Dream tracks from the Risky Business soundtrack that were guide points for this in terms of that floaty synthesizer intro and even the main kind of beat underneath. And I realized sort of after the fact that the big drum fill in the song is kind of a lift from In the Air Tonight by Phil Collins.
Oh, yes!
Which wasn't really intentional, but once I realized that's what it was doing, I was like, oh, well, that's perfect.
Funny story about that. Our friend Jim Matheson in Toronto, he makes Eurorack modules with Neutron Sound. He designs them. Well, I'd sent him a track to bounce off of him because I always like to get his opinions. And when he heard that drum fill originally, it was so loud it scared his cats.
The coat of night wrapped around me. Worrying at the thread. Better off dead. Better off dead.
It's turned out to be one of my favorite ones on the record. The chord progression is actually pretty simple, but I love that floaty synth intro. Your sax stuff just really makes the song shine, and there's something about I think the vocal delivery and the imagery that just all comes together really nicely. And
originally, you were using that Roland D50 Syrah flute on there, and our wives both hated it.
Yeah.
Why did they hate it?
The famous emulator shakuhachi sample, which was one of those sonic signifiers from the 80s that I love. And I was like, this will be perfect, and I want to use it on a song. And so originally I was playing it, and my wife heard it, and she was like, that's fucking cheesy.
Same with my wife.
You can't do that. This song is good, and this just ruins the song.
So I said, you know what? I think it needs a saxophone. And he goes, I know a guy. When I heard it, I was just blown away.
And I immediately started thinking about all of those great reference points from the 80s that had these sax parts, in particular the Miami Vice playing sax on You Belong to the City and how iconic that was, or Glenn Frey's Heat Is On from the Beverly Hills Cop soundtrack. One of the other big touch points for Brian was this artist called Gunship. That's another big synthwave artist, and on their new album, which I think they announced while we were finishing up End.Game, they got Tim Capello to play saxophone on their single. And Tim Capello is famously known as the muscular, shirtless sax guy from the Lost Boys movie who played in Tina Turner's band.
But I also have to thank you both, because I hadn't been playing for about 20 years.
I'm just so grateful that we were able to get you to do that, John. It was one of those moments that, like, when I heard the track, I just got this big smile on my face, and it was like, this is so much better than I had expected it was going to be.
So I'm just following this songs as if they're a story, because so what was amazing was that moment of euphoria in Midnight Driving. After you drop off your significant other, your girlfriend, boyfriend, there's this moment where you're back in reality again, passing the palm trees, and you're better off dead, and this kind of depression happens when you're by yourself. And then I think in a way, Black Dawn is it's almost a climax in a way, and then it does a denouement.
So one thing is Black Dawn kicks off side 2. I felt like we needed to have a couple of more up-tempo or a little more aggressive songs, so it wasn't all dirgy and ballady. And I also felt like we had a lot of songs that were sort of talking about the aftermath. We needed to have a song that was kind of like, what is the thing that happened? Much of the lyrical imagery is pulled again right out of the mixtape article, but punched up and leavened up. It's kind of a description of the apocalypse happening, or the Black Dawn is sort of the end of the old. When we hear a title like Black Dawn, we can't help but think about Black Celebration by Depeche Mode, or Black Planet by Sisters of Mercy. So I went back and listened to both of those songs. The Chrome Pyramids line, Brian's a big fan of that. But I also thought that it was a wonderful, ambiguous, and suggestive thing, particularly this notion of like chrome pyramids on the skyline. Are they missiles? Are they aliens? Are they helmets of soldiers?
It's a black dawn. A black dawn in a phantom time. Black dawn. Chrome pyramids on the skyline.
Ultimately, like a lot of the songs on the record, it's less about, like, I'm going to tell a story about this person, and more, I want this kind of fragmentary, disjointed imagery that is not explicit.
Mentioned earlier, I'm a huge fan of Gunship. And they've got a lot of black sun imagery in their songs as well, which I assume they, of course, got from Depeche Mode as well. But I incorporated that. Instead of black sun, it's the Black Dawn. Yeah, I threw a crunchy guitar on top of that.
Oh, that was you with the crunchy guitar.
And there's a Easter egg in here for you, John. So so I was thinking, okay, well, I wanted some kind of like this like choir sound. I wanted it to be kind of gothy, but I didn't want like a full-on symphonic, realistic Hollywood choir. So what did I do? I thought about my favorite old band, jh0st. I tracked down the original emulator sound discs for the choir that the Mirage used, and that's the sound.
I noticed that. Yes, for sure. Maybe it was that reference that triggered this for me, but When I heard Black Dawn, I can imagine it being played live, like smoke, lights, guitars on stage. It has this epic live vibe to it.
A lot of them I intend for him to be able to play live with his band, because we live 1,500 miles apart. If he wants to play them live, more power to him. Go right ahead.
I do agree that it would be a great set starter. You can just sort of imagine the lights all down with that sequence going in the fog.
Oh, yeah.
And everything kind of.
That's exactly
up.
What I was seeing. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe someday.
War Games is funny.
That is my wife's favorite song on the record. I have been in trouble for a year over that one, but oh well.
Oh really? What do you mean you've been in trouble?
You've got a limited amount of space on the record, right? Yeah. And we had to cut something.
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting about the vinyl renaissance is that the wizardry that used to exist for cutting longer vinyl is gone. Many vinyl pressing plants these days have very strict limits about how many minutes of music they'll let you put. Initially, I was worried that the record was going to be too short. But as we got to the finish line and we started thinking about doing a vinyl release, it became clear that we weren't going to be able to fit all of the songs. War Games is another song that I wrote most of. I felt like it was the best candidate for cutting. Unfortunately, it's Brian's wife's favorite song. So it's available on the digital download, and it's intended to be part of the album, but it's not on the vinyl release. It is a Gary Newman homage. I've been a fan of his for a long time, particularly his first 5 or 6 records. The lyrics at the end, you can hear me singing the Assassin's Dance tonight, Stormtrooper and Drag tonight, Pleasure Principle tonight. Well,
oh, yeah.
I Assassin was a Gary Newman record that has some fretless bass on it. Dance is a Gary Newman record that has a fretless bass on it. Mm-hmm. Pleasure Principle was this big breakthrough that had cars on it, and he had a song called Stormtrooper and Drag from that dance era that's just amazing. So the lyrics are a pretty not particularly veiled metaphor about being physically intimate with somebody.
Will you fight? Will you fight for love, love, love? Head to head for love, love. It's so hard. It's so hard for you. It's so hard for you.
The whole thing is such an amazing story to me if you just listen from song to song. And Black Dawn, the protagonist realizes he's got to assemble the forces in battle, what's going to happen, But then the AIs that are going to take over the world, they send a replicant to seduce him. He's falling for her and he knows he shouldn't. And so she's an assassin, she's in drag, all that kind of stuff.
That's good. I mean, part of Brian's story was this idea that artificial entities were among humans in every way.
The pairing of War Games and J9 I thought was very intentional. Bringing in these kind of artificial entities, not as just computer programs or code, but actually humanized.
The way I always perceived it and the way we presented it was that the kind of guys who would want a sex robot like that, they really don't respect women. He doesn't even name her. You want me to get undefined object? It's an anti-misogynistic song.
I think it's useful perspective, and one of the things that Brian had been watching Blade Runner 2049 when it came out, and a major plot line in that movie is the involvement of the main character with this kind of holographic robot entity. For me, J9 touches on a lot of delicate topics about post-human relationships, right, as you were talking about. Is she replacing someone human, etc.? We had this notion of, well, there's artificials and there's humans, and that inevitably means that there's going to be relationships and tension. I was having dinner with a friend of mine whose name is Janine, and it was one of those sort of like amazing moments of inspiration where I was looking at her and I was like, J9. And she's beautiful, and she had made this amazing dinner, and I was just sort of imagining her as like this artificially perfect partner. The three of us talking here, we're all old enough to remember a time before the internet, And in our lifetimes, it's gone from no internet, so you would meet people at bars or, wherever on the street, to you guys met on the internet, to you guys didn't meet on the internet, and now technology has kind of interposed itself in almost all of these interactions, right?
I'm not alone now. She's there. You don't understand us, but I don't care. J9, I say this.
Basically, it's sort of the inevitability of people loving machines and anthropomizing technology. It doesn't take much to trick humans into building relationships with things that aren't humans or aren't animate. At the same time, I have sort of a perverse nature in that I don't want to go for the obvious preachy direction. So I thought part of what would make the song work is if it's, kind of from the perspective of the person in the relationship who's like, there's nothing wrong with this, and I don't care what you think anyway because we're in love.
This song has both sides of the coin. It has the misogyny, but it also has a sense of loss, that the character did have a relationship with death.
Just like you used to be.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And somehow the revolution or the glitch, she might have violently died and he doesn't even remember it. But that sense of loss is there. And then the misogyny comes in because he has a perfected version of her and can just command her at will.
A lot of people are unwilling to see how they might need to change for the better. I think everyone should, strive to be better. Be the best person you are. And, if you want to have a robot, that's not exactly how it's supposed to be.
It seems inevitable to me that, Amazon or Apple or some company yet to be named is going to come up with some kind of robot partner. It doesn't even have to be particularly good. It just has to be enough to fool us. It's sort of Alexa on steroids, right?
Video at night, the character realizes that everything is, it's a glitched video. If there's character growth in this story, he's actually realizing that, even including J9, that everything is a simulacrum.
We had this long conversation over Facebook Messenger about, how the things we'd done. And then the very next day, it seemed he had video at night.
You were having some really tough times.
Yes.
And
indeed, I have. Looks like you took kind of an intimate conversation we had and you put it into song form, and yeah, it touched me indeed. It's a great track. It's my favorite on the record.
It's become my favorite on the record too, and it's a sort of waking from a dream moment, right? And it's like, are you waking from the dream or are you slipping into it?
Am I awake or dreaming? Can't tell anymore. Silhouettes are dancing in front of my eyes. There are pieces missing, edited and spliced. This life feels like video at night in uncertain times.
This song was written literally days before I was diagnosed with a very serious illness. Basically, went downstairs about 11 o'clock at night to the studio and started working. I came up with basically the whole song, trying to get across this sense of things not quite being real. And then sonically, the beat is basically a Lindrum version of Billie Jean by Michael Jackson.
Oh, wow.
The bell part, that little bell hook, is kind of cribbed from Rapture by Blondie. It's also got kind of a recreation or our take on a secret message from a John Carpenter movie in the bridge. And we put it here on the record. I put it here because it's kind of like this moment where it's almost like you've dozed off in the middle of a movie and you wake up for a second and you're trying to remember, was I watching a movie or was I dreaming?
It is powerful that way. And again, the moments of power in this record are not about huge walls of sound or distortion, or although it does have those, of course, but it kind of decrescendos, and that's where it really sustains a very, very powerful emotional moment.
As you can tell, perhaps from this conversation, I do a lot of thinking about what goes into the music that I make.
Oh, yeah.
But while it may oftentimes be fairly intellectual or thought out, I worry that it's not emotionally expressive in the ways that I would like it to be, in the way that, for example, some of your music is, John. And this is one of those ones where I feel like the total effect is pretty impactful, the timbre of my voice as well as the notes that I'm singing.
And just when you thought that the sorrowful, the kind of melancholy couldn't get any more, Tokyo Rain, this is where you have the danger where sometimes a movie drops so low that you lose the audience. I think Tokyo Rain is that moment, and for me, it makes this record. Tokyo Rain's my favorite song on here. I don't know who that was singing in the background, but really amazing.
Vocalese from Heaviosity. I get all of their things for free. And so everything Heaviosity does, and they do some very high-end cinematic instrument. You know, I use the Complete Control and Native Instruments machine. They have a neat system called NKS, like we use with the Arturia Classic Collection, and it maps out everything on these old synths to hardware, which is right in front of me.
Incredible. You are an AI, aren't you?
You still haven't seen his face for real, John. Sometimes what Brian would do is he sent me parts. The day after he sent them to me, he sent me a follow-up email. He's like, that stuff is no good, man.
Most of the time I send the stuff I send him, I'm like, you know what? That's just crap.
He'd sent me this thing, and it had this female vocal, which is in some ways very outside the palette. I hit play and I heard this vocal start to loop, and it reminded me of that scene from the original Blade Runner of like the blimp going across the sky with Japanese
the outer colonies.
Yeah, singing, right? and kind of echoing off the buildings.
Gray stones under your feet, neon light lights the street, and you think you've got it all figured out. You're really in the swing, but you don't understand the world. You don't understand a thing.
I used to work for Sony, and I traveled to Tokyo extensively, and I learned a little bit of Japanese. I was also thinking about the fact that in the 80s, Japan had kind of this mythic status, this kind of innovation factory where all of the amazing stuff was coming out, these magical electronic. And
the imagery you would see on TV back then of Tokyo was just like a wonderland.
It was the future, right? And these are also big synthwave tropes. And I wanted to have that kind of like fragmentary thing, almost like you're standing on one of those streets with all these kind of neons flashing and competing for your attention. The Japanese word that I'm singing there, wakari masen, loosely translates to like, I don't understand. Basically, it's sort of this kind of conclusion, like it says in the song, you think you've got it all figured out, but you don't understand a thing. And that's mostly about the way I feel about life. The simplicity of the chorus combined with that wonderful PPG sound that just makes me think of like subway trains coming into the station. And my father is not a big fan of my music, but he loved this song. Played it over and over and over again.
That's amazing. And contrasting Ocean City to Tokyo, I mean, geographically we're going very far, but Ocean City is nostalgic and it's familiar, and Tokyo is unfamiliar and futuristic. And so having those two spaces in this album is very powerful. Well, if we're going to talk about Japan, when I first heard your record, I listened to it on headphones. Now I'm calling it Walkman aesthetic.
One of the things that I think has really changed about music in our lifetimes is that people aren't really paying attention. If people are listening carefully, they're doing it on headphones.
Not everyone has, a nice turntable with monitors, and you're able to sit down and really experience the record, the way it's meant to be.
from my perspective, I don't want to throw shade on the synthwave scene, but a lot of it is frankly not super interesting from a sonic perspective.
Indeed.
I think about all the projects I work on in the context of what is it going to sound like for someone who's got good headphones and is listening.
On that, that's why we going with Michael Haitley for mastering. He's a wizard. He's got a lot of big names under his belt. Originally, I was going to master it, but when we got too close to the end, I knew we had something different. It needed a special touch that I just wasn't prepared to do. I was scared to master it.
And full disclosure, I wrote a little joke on your Facebook post a couple months ago about listening in mono. This is how dark this story gets. I have a Bluetooth receiver that I hooked up to that monitor, and that's how I listen to your record. I've been listening to some version of this setup, this one monitor, everything in mono, enjoying the pleasure of just a single speaker source.
Well, I hope it sounded good in mono.
It sounds fantastic. And that goes to songwriting. If the songwriting is interesting and solid and engaging, it actually works.
Brilliant lyricist. The way he writes so ambiguously, and lets the listener make their own judgment about the songs, which is kind of important.
And then speaking of lyrics, again, the last track
That you'll hear is that Ronald Reagan sample.
Yeah, there's some stuff going on there, though.
My fellow Americans, we begin bombing in 5 minutes. And he said that on live TV, and back then, that was a big, big deal.
And he didn't know the mic was live, and he was supposed to be humorous, I guess.
In 5 minutes.
To end an album with this energy is not really an ending. It's a to-be-continued moment.
It's meant to, kind of make you want to flip it over and listen to it again. Did it happen? Was it real?
Brian basically made this track, and the original track that he sent was about 5 or 6 minutes long. And I was thinking that, we wanted to have this kind of bracketing of like, here's this little 1 minute thing at the beginning, and then maybe something that was like 1 minute at the end. It's kind of like you're watching a movie on cable TV late at night and they're speeding up the credits racing by. And I sort of wanted that kind of cheesy early 80s thing of like, the end? With a question mark. And also, as Brian notes, because it's talking about bombing, I love the fact that since it's all like time shuffled and out of joint, it's almost like this is the precursor to start the record, right? This is also why those two instrumentals have these kind of strange date titles. Like one is literally the last day of the year before New Year's Day, and then the other one, the date has been redacted.
Well, speaking of bringing you back around, there's another record. So that's what I was thinking. You guys already knew that there was going to be another record, and that's why you ended it on this.
Well, before we talk about that, after, he went through his treatment, we recorded a song called Bad Science, just to get us back in. And he was kind of down, didn't know if he could sing again. And so we made that song kind of get him back in the game, and I love it.
Yeah, so I wasn't sure if Brian and I were going to work again. Probably, I want to say even 9 months ago, Brian started sending me some loops and stuff, and I was just like, yeah, I'll get around to it, I'll start listening to it. And it was only once we were in the pandemic that I had this kind of ocean of time. Like one anxiety that, of course, we all have is like, well, what if it's not as good as the last time? I guess what I'd say is it's a different story and a different background, but it's similarly focused on questions of what is real.
The sound itself will still be, retro, but it's probably going to make the synthwave nerds kind of mad.
What I'd say is sonically, we've been listening to a much broader range of things. And
Indeed.
If you think about that 19AO period from the late 70s to the early 80s, it's filled with a lot of great music. And Brian and I have been really interested in sort of early experiments fusing guitars and technology on records by ZZ Top, ZZ Top's Eliminator. I think is actually a record that doesn't really get the respect that it deserves. Def Leppard's Pyromania and Hysteria.
Yes,
practically.
Another great one. I've been listening to Def Leppard a lot too. I've got their greatest hits.
Yeah, when you listen to those records, they're practically electronic music with guitars. We sort of don't want to be stuck in the synthwave box. It's that, but I think it's even more cinematic than the last record, and hopefully beautiful and surprising.